We continue our opponent preview series with Nebraska, and I'm pleased to be joined by Steven Sipple from Husker Online from the On3 Sports Network. And Steven, appreciate you joining me.
Yeah, great. Really happy to do it, Brian.
Yeah, Husker fans and Buffalo fans don't like each other, but I'm confident that beat writers can be civil and get through an interview and a preview here. What do you think?
Well, we're a couple of veterans that made it this far, so I think we should be civil. Okay.
Yeah, and we can bond in the fact that we've both seen not very good football in the last several years, at least not
Right.
what we're used to seeing. And Nebraska has not been as bad as Colorado was last year or even the year before that, but certainly not by Nebraska standards. And real quick, I want to get more on 2023, but I want to get your take. When Nebraska hired Scott Frost, I thought that was maybe the most perfect hire I've seen in college football, and it just did not work. Why did the Scott Frost era not ever work and get off the ground like people thought it might?
I think it's. I mean, we could do a whole show on that.
Right.
It's complex. I mean, the one thing, I guess, Brian, the way I always put it to people, it's like a big bull that just got away from him. The job got away from him.
Yeah.
I think there's reasons that he could have controlled that he didn't do a good job of. And then there were some pretty tough circumstances too, like COVID. They went, for instance, Brian, I wouldn't expect people to understand this that weren't right in the vortex of this storm, but Nebraska kind of went all in on training through COVID, and they were going to be the aggressive ones. And it didn't work. In fact, it backfired. At the end of the season, the kids had trained for so long and they were kind of done. They declined to go to a bowl game. Nebraska was 3-5. They went 3-5. And you know what, Brian? That was 220. 221 didn't go well, but people at the end of 221, there was still some people saying, you know what, they played teams close. But then here's what happened. Interestingly, 2022 just got out of control fast.
Yeah.
They lost on their home field to Georgia Southern and couldn't stop them. Okay. Well, they lost right out of the chute. They lost right out of the chute to Northwestern in Ireland. Then they lose to Georgia Southern and they get blown out by Oklahoma, and everybody knew it was over, but it kind of happened fast.
Yeah.
So that's the law. He did a poor job recruiting. I think a lot of people, Brian, recognize it just seemed like it didn't work that hard. It just didn't seem like he was all in.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the conversation here.
Yeah, well, let's turn the page to 2023. It's a new era, certainly. Matt Rhule comes in, a veteran professional coach, literally. I mean, he was in the NFL the last several years. What, in your mind, being around that program this offseason, how has the culture changed with him coming in here?
Culture, it's so early to judge it too much. The one thing that's different from like when a lot of head coaches come into places, he's been very complimentary of what he inherited. He's not, remember, well, a lot of people, if you're not familiar with Matt Rhule, when he went to Temple, it was a mess. When he went to Baylor, it was a mess. And it took him a while to get those off the ground. Their first seasons were bad, two-win seasons, 3-win seasons. He says this isn't like those situations. He thinks he walked into a decent situation that the team GPA was above 3.0. He says that's unheard of. He identifies NFL talent on the roster publicly. I think he thinks they can be pretty good, and that's kind of a culture. I think I'm addressing that to a certain extent. I mean, his whole modus operandi is, hey, we're not that bad, So culture. Well, one thing that's way different than Frost is he is very public himself. Like, he is out amongst the people. He is he's at tennis matches. He brings his players to tennis matches on campus, to other sports too, obviously. He is out and about. That's much different than not only Frost, That's different than Pelini. That's different than Solich. So that's culture. As far as pure football culture, it'd be easier to answer that after he kind of gets going a little bit.
Yeah.
But one thing, if you want to say culture, there's different, you can answer that different ways, and culture means different things to different people, but they're going to run the ball. He wants the program to be back to sort of this punishing Nebraska ground game that they can win, they can wear you down and then win in the fourth quarter. That's a big part of what he wants. Brian, they're going to huddle.
Yeah.
That's a big change. They're going to huddle. This is going to be a team that huddles. This is a team that's bringing back the fullback. So they want to run out of the eye. Not all the time, but they want to run out of the eye. So those are all pretty marked differences.
Yeah, and that was going to be my next question. I know that they're going to be more kind of ball control. You get back to what they were. I mean, they were obviously, the up tempo offenses we've seen around college football the last several years. What you've seen, is this roster made up to where they can succeed with a ball control offense this year?
Well, the big question, Brian, is the offensive line, and that's been a question mark for a few years now.
Yeah.
Now the bad news is all those guys are back. The good news is all those guys are back.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. These guys now, I'm talking about, like Teddy Prohaska and Turner Corcoran and Nordine Newely and Bryce Benhart are all juniors and seniors. And you know how it is. That's what offensive linemen should be at their best, right?
Yep.
So I think that's what they're banking on. They brought in Ben Scott from Arizona State, whom you may be familiar with. He was a good player, a 2-year starter at Arizona State. He's going to be the starting center, and he's regarded as an NFL prospect. So they bolstered their line that way. Hey, Brian, if you walked over to practice, even today, they work out in June, you know how it goes, and you looked at the offensive line for Nebraska, you'd say, whoa, that's a big, good-looking offensive line.
Yeah.
Why they haven't been able to put it together, sort of curious to me. I think it's a combination of coaching, changing schemes. Now we'll see. We'll see what it looks like. But those guys really have no excuse now.
Yeah. And obviously one of the big things always is going to be quarterback. And, I think CU fans were maybe a little surprised when, Casey Thompson left. I mean, this is a guy that they saw in the Alamo Bowl a couple years ago and torched him. He came off the bench. I'm blanking the name of the Texas quarterback. It was really good.
I'm blanking on it too. Was it Sam Ehlinger?
Yes, Sam Ehlinger gets injured in that Alamo Bowl. Casey comes in and just torches CU. So the CU fans were, from what I've heard, were a little surprised to see that. But I mean, Jeff Sims comes in, a 3-year starter at Georgia Tech, had a lot of success. I know injuries probably the last couple of years, but what's your thoughts on Jeff Sims? Sounds like he had a really good spring and fits well in what Coach Rhule wants to do.
Well, the coaching staff loves him. He's their hand-picked guy.
Yeah.
Like you said, came from Georgia Tech. Rhule had a relationship with the former Georgia head coach Collins. If you see Sims, I'll start with this. If you see him, you say, wow. I mean, that like 6'4", 220.
Yeah.
And he does have a gun. And guess what, Brian? He can run it.
Yeah.
I mean, now he's a pass-first guy. And those are the scariest guys, the pass-first guys that can run. Right, and really run.
Yeah,
I mean, he runs it. I don't know if maybe you remember Jamal Lord. He kind of reminds me of Jamal Lord because he's so big and can run through guys. Very enticing. But here's the deal, Brian. Completed 57.5% of his passes at Georgia Tech, and I think that was I want to say 23 starts, something in that range. So there's a representative sample. 57.5% passer. 23 picks, 30 interceptions, 23 picks. Not the numbers that you want, but man, again,
30 touchdowns.
Yeah, 30 touchdowns, 23 picks.
Yeah.
Not the ratio you want, but when you see him, you're like, wow. I mean, you can see why coaches think, okay, this is our guy. Now, they asked him in the spring, cut down on turnovers, improve your completion percentage. He did. I don't know those numbers. They're unofficial, but he's the guy. And he is, I got to tell you, I saw him in the spring game. I saw him. That was the first time I really got an in-person long look at him. It's intriguing. He was 9 for 13 passing, smart, intelligent decisions. Ran the ball pretty well. Didn't run for a big number, but ran over a guy on the way to a touchdown at one point. And they're banking it. Any conversation about Nebraska should start with Sims.
Yeah. And then let's go to the other side of the ball, because defensively they struggled last year. Have a lot of guys back though, and it seems like you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like the strength is going to be more on the back end of that defense, the secondary and linebackers, right?
Oh, 100%. They're good in the secondary.
Yeah,
they have a lot of guys, and they're good, legitimate guys. I mean, Quentin Newsome he's going to play in the NFL. I don't know if he's a 2nd-round pick or a 7th-round pick, but he's going to get drafted. He's a corner. They really like Malcolm Hartzog at the other corner. They got a lot of safeties, too many to mention. There's 4 or 5 guys that could start that they'd feel good about. Linebackers, it's not quite as I wouldn't feel quite as good about the linebacker core, but they have enough guys, and they changed the defense, so it's kind of hard to even identify who's a linebacker and who's a rush in, because they're playing a 3-3-5. But they are definitely stronger in the back end. In fact, one of the big question marks is, do they have enough of? And that's really a question in the Big Ten, because teams like Minnesota will just pound it at you until you can prove you can stop them. Yeah. But Brian, they got better on. They weren't that bad on defense after Oklahoma. They held in there pretty well. Now, you would probably say, and it's correct, well, Big Ten, those offenses they played weren't very good.
Yeah.
So if you just look at the scores, you'd say, man, their defense wasn't that bad, but you got to kind of keep in mind they're playing against some pretty bad offenses.
Yeah. So let's wrap up here. Okay. Colorado looks at this schedule and they look at Nebraska coming in here. I don't want to say licking their chops, but they're excited to have Nebraska come into Boulder, right? And they've beaten them the last 2 times that they've been out. Both teams have been out of the conference. CU's 2-0 against them. These fans cannot wait to see Nebraska in Boulder. And I know that fans are looking at that and saying that could be a win. But I also know Nebraska looks at their schedule and sees Colorado and says that could be a win.
Yeah, they are.
And what do you expect out of Nebraska? I mean, kind of what Matt Rhule's first year. What are you expecting out of Nebraska? I mean, this is going to be a good game in Boulder, I believe. But what do you expect out of them? Are they a bowl team?
I think they could be. I mean, Matt has kind of painted that picture like this team should win, 5, 7, maybe 8 games. C5 wouldn't do it, but you're close. It looks to me like a 6, 7, or 8 win team. But if they would lose the first 2, if they lose at Minnesota, then lose to Colorado, that conversation changes a lot. If you're asking me what I expect Nebraska to be a much more physical team, especially on offense. I do think they'll really they're going to emphasize the run. There's no question about that. They're going to try to establish what I call kind of a traditional ground game, not necessarily with the quarterback. The last you were familiar with Nebraska, they ran Martinez a lot. In fact, he was their leading rusher in one season. I don't think you're going to see that. It'll be more of a traditional ground game where they're under center a little bit more. There's just handoffs to the running back. A little more old school.
Yeah.
And I expect to see a more physical team.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Well, one last thing for you. You excited for the trip to Boulder?
Brian, I got to tell you, I'm 56. I've been out there a lot. I've been covering the team for 30 years. And I love it. I love going to Boulder. It is intense. It is gorgeous.
Yeah.
It brings back all kinds of memories. The stadium's great for media because we're pretty close. We're not a zillion miles up. So I've always loved those trips.
Yeah. Well, I got to say, I've covered games in Lincoln twice. The last game that they were both in the Big 12 together, and then the one game non-conference was, I think, 2017, whatever it was. But Nebraska is one of the best atmospheres I've been in too. So, and these 2 teams, whenever they play, it's going to be a fun game. CU likes to keep the red out. They're not going to. There's going to be a lot of Nebraska fans there, but that's going to be a fun one. I'm looking forward to that game. It's one of the most anticipated games on the schedule, I think. It's going to be a big noon kickoff. Fox is going to be there, things like that. So it's going to be fun, and I look forward to seeing you there.
Yeah. Hey, Brian, I'm glad we did this, and I definitely look forward to seeing you in September.
Sounds good. Thanks, Steven. Appreciate it.